So I would like to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us for what I think is going to be a fascinating discussion. And as you know, we're talking this evening about leveraging history and looking for critical insights for today's global leaders. And we have a wonderful source of information. Many of you may know him from work that he's done at UT. But for those who don't, Gary Hoover is a serial entrepreneur. He's a business historian. He's an author and a teacher. And he was the founder of Bookstop, which I remember well as the first American book superstore chain, book chain. And he then co-founded a company that became Hoovers.com, which is a business information source. Gary was also Macomb's first entrepreneur in residence just a few years ago. So those of you who are seniors may know him from that time. And more recently, he's become the executive director of the American Business History Center. So he's a trailblazer in diverse ways. And we are delighted to hear from him today about business history and how it can inform the present, how it informs the present and can inform the future as well. So Gary, given your diverse interests and accomplishments, it's interesting that your career has led you to the American Business History Center. That's a wonderful source of information on business history, especially the videos. So I encourage you to check that out. I'll put the link in the text box at some point in the chat. So obviously you consider business history a really important topic, and we are delighted to ask you more about this. So my first question for you is, what are some important aspects of business history that business people should, but typically don't know?
Yeah, you know, let me step back a little bit. The whole idea of the American Business History Center, it's americanbusinesshistory.org. My friends and I started that almost 2 years ago, and it's really grown since then. We have a free weekly newsletter. My thing, I grew up in a General Motors factory town, city in Indiana, Anderson, Indiana, 60,000 population, 27,000 worked at General Motors. So it was huge. And we're sitting there in the classroom and the teachers are talking about leadership styles, management styles, kings, presidents, governors, generals, all that. And, you know, whether people followed them or not, what kind of leader they were, their strategies, how they made decisions, who won the battle, who lost the battle. And it's all fascinating. And I said, well, what about General Motors? You know, they're kind of important in this little old town. And they're like, oh, they make Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac. Oh, I said, I know all that. I said, but who runs it? You know, are they smart or are they stupid? Sometimes we think anybody that runs a big company is smart, but if you're old enough, you've heard of a company called Enron and another one called Drexel Burnham. And now today we can look at Sears Roebuck and Kmart. No, sometimes they're idiots. The head of Enron died in prison, you know, and he had an MBA from one of the finest business schools. Their whole management team did, and they didn't understand business. So, you know, who started General Motors? Why did they start it? What does it believe in? Nobody can answer those questions. So I actually started subscribing to Fortune magazine when I was 12 years old and reading the history of General Motors and then all these other companies. So gosh, in a couple of weeks, I'll be 70 years old. So I guess that's what, 58 years that I've been a business history junkie. Well, as I've gone through life, I got a liberal arts education, a major in economics at the University of Chicago. As I went through all that, I've studied every industry. Hoover's, I think we covered 3,000 or 4,000 companies when I was there. I think I saw the other day on the Dun & Bradstreet site, they bought Hoover's, that they now cover 300 million enterprises or some crazy number like that. But as I look at it, business people don't have a sense of history. I mean, if you study medicine, you've got to at least do the Hippocratic Oath or whatever. Hopefully they learn some history. Lawyers, almost all they learn is history, you know, precedents and the Constitution and some of the, but going back to the Magna Carta and whatever. And I don't think you can understand any field if you don't understand its origins, why it exists, its evolution, how it got to where it is today. You cannot, Steve Jobs said, you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. Winston Churchill said the same thing. The further backward you look, the further forward you can see. And yet, as I have met hundreds or thousands of CEOs of big companies and everything, tens of thousands of entrepreneurs in like over 40 countries where I've taught and given lectures and all that kind of jazz. Almost no knowledge of business history. So we fail to learn the lessons of the past because nothing that matters in business is new. The techniques, the technologies change all the time. You know, at one time, if you were going to advertise, you put signs on the side of railroad cars, you know, you use the telegraph. Today it's Facebook, you know, Google ads, whatever. And tomorrow it'll be yet another thing. The hours that people shop, you know, when I was a kid, stores weren't open Sundays, but then women entered the workforce and people stopped shopping Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and the stores found out they had to be open long hours. But if you study history, you found out in the 1890s, almost all the stores were open incredibly long hours because the miners and the railroad workers and everybody, they were working around the clock. And a lot of these little general stores were open until midnight. A lot of them were open Sundays. So to some degree, things come and go, you know, and that there's a pendulum, and that's what we're seeing. But all the mistakes that you read about in Forbes or Fortune or The Economist or online, they've been made before. All the good ideas have been done before. All the management ways of rewarding people have I just had a long email conversation with one of my good buddies about stock options and whether they worked or not and the good and bad things. All those things go back in time. If you look, every tech company, take them, they deal with a whole bunch of questions, such questions as, when I plan the future, should I listen to the Wall Street, to the financiers, or should I listen to my engineers or the product designers? When I make a product, should I just make one product and make them all the same and blow them out the door? Or should I customize them for each customer? Does design matter? Should I just make an ugly thing that does a trick, or should I design it and make it nice looking? That was a big difference between Apple and virtually all of its competitors until Samsung rose up and began to take them on in the hardware, the smartphones and everything. Well, I got a list like 30 questions like that high-tech people deal with. All of them were dealt with between 1910 and 1930 by Henry Ford, Walter P. Chrysler, and Alfred Sloan. Sloan was the management genius that built General Motors, the man really responsible for it becoming really the greatest company on earth at its peak, which is now long past. But the thing is, these things just come around, and yet we don't study them. If you Google almost any subject, like some very obscure breed of dogs, or you know, wine country in some country you've never heard of, or there's any subject you look up, there's a website. And some subjects, there's 1,000 websites. But if you Google business history, there's nothing, or there was nothing. And so that, my friends and I, that's our mission, is to change that, to reach students of all ages, to reach business leaders and managers. And then, to be frank, a lot of our current readers are just history buffs that are interested in history of all types. And business history overall kind of gets short shrift. Historians tend to obsess on war and politics, you know. If you read history books, you will see a lot less on religion, on sports, on home life, what the development of the kitchen was like, and on business. I mean, they appear once in a while, but there's so many aspects of life that get left out of a lot of your basic history because they're so obsessed with war and politics, which often are not the most uplifting parts of life. Yeah.
So, so that's I think those are really important points, and I've put the American Business History .org URL in the chat for all of you, and I encourage you to take a look at that. There are fascinating things there, and I must say, for a young organization that is filling an enormous void, you have been prolific. There's a lot.
We're working at it. Our readership is growing really fast. We're up about 700% over a year ago.
Wow. Well, there is tremendous value there. And some of the biographies I think you would find very interesting. I'm going to ask, Gary, I'm going to ask you to give us some recommendations on those later. Sure. But I want to move into the sort of the international aspect of the things that you've been seeing. So you've mentioned that you've been studying business for more than 50 years now. And I'm curious, during that time, how has the global structure of industry changed? And what do you see coming in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually pulled up one of the posts that we did on the website. It was called The Biggest Companies in the World. And in it, I looked back to 1962. So there you are, almost 60 years. And at that point, if you looked at the 20 biggest companies in the world, and when I say biggest companies, I always mean measured by revenue, by sales. That has been the standard measure at least since the 1950s. And I think if you're going to have to pick one measure of size, it's the best one. And every public company reveals the number. And even on privately held companies where you can't buy stock, you can usually find estimates of their size. You can almost always find estimates. If you look back in 1962, of the 20 biggest companies in the world, 17 of them were from the United States. General Motors was not only the biggest, it was more than twice as big as the biggest foreign company, which was Royal Dutch Shell, the big oil company. Of the 17 US companies, 13 of them were what I would call industrials. Big oil was in there, but also auto manufacturing. General Motors and Ford were both in there. General Electric was in there, right? Yep. Chrysler, yeah, so all three automakers. So really, you go back 50 years, 60 years, 17 out of 20 are American and 13 of the 17 were industrial. I then went forward to 1994, which is around halfway between now and then, right? And that time, the top four companies were all Japanese. Now, that got a little tricky because the one industry where measuring by sales is risky is trading companies, because sometimes they can count the total value of the transaction. So like a big grain trading company like Cargill, the biggest US private company, they could sign a deal to move $1 billion of wheat to Russia, but they might actually only collect like a 1% commission on the deal and never touch the wheat. So they have some option. Do we count the billion or just the lower figure? Just like Amazon on Marketplace, the third-party sellers, in Amazon's sales and revenue figure they report, they do not include the value of the merchandise you buy. You can find that number. It's called GMV, gross merchandise value. Find estimates of it online and stuff. But they only count the 8% or 10% or whatever commission they get. So that kind of screwed up the numbers in '94. But if I skip past the Japanese companies, if I look at the top 20, even including them, there were only 6 US companies. So less than half as many, down from 13, and only 4 of them were industrial companies. But still, General Motors and Ford and Exxon were the biggest. And if you take the Japanese guys out, still the trading companies, the next biggest was Royal Dutch Shell, which is right in there. Now, we fast forward, the last year for which data is all available is 2019, because the 2020 results of big companies are not all fully reported yet. Fortune magazine will publish a list of the global biggest companies. I think usually comes out maybe in August, but later this year. So, but in 2019, we're down to 8 US companies out of 20. And only one of those is truly an industrial company, and that's ExxonMobil. The biggest US companies in the world, first of all, Walmart, which is the biggest company on earth, and it was the first company in the history of the world to reach $500 billion in annual sales, 500 billion in annual sales. Nobody had ever done that before. They just did that in the last few years. Then after them are 3 Chinese companies, but they're all state-owned. And I think I would just soon leave them off the list in terms of really thinking about companies, because they're either wholly or majority state-owned. They're Sinopec, which is oil, right? State Grid, which is electricity, and China National Petroleum, another oil company. And then you have Royal Dutch Shell is the next biggest company in the world. Saudi Aramco, man, oil is still such a huge business. Volkswagen, British Petroleum, Amazon, so that's the second biggest US company. Toyota, second biggest in autos after Volkswagen. Then ExxonMobil. So Royal Dutch Shell and BP are both bigger in annual revenues. They're all in $200 billion plus range than Royal Dutch Shell. And Royal Dutch is still the biggest European? No, it is. Yeah, it's ahead of Volkswagen. Europeans have never been up the top list. But then the rest of the big 8 US companies after ExxonMobil, the next one is Apple. I didn't count them as industrial. It's impossible to categorize Apple. Is it a wholesaler? Is it a retailer? Is it a design company? I don't think it's really a manufacturing company. I don't think they have a lot of factories. Then health companies, CVS Health, United Health, and McKesson. McKesson's the biggest distributor, wholesaler of drugs in the world, in the U.S. and the world. But I did skip one: CVS Health, Berkshire Hathaway, United Health, and McKesson, and that rounds out the 8 big U.S. companies. And then you've got a mining company. Then you finally have a Korean company, Samsung, at 19th, and Daimler, the German auto and truck and bus maker, 20th. But Berkshire Hathaway is interesting because it's truly a conglomerate, which is kind of a business concept that's been disproven. All the great conglomerates founded in the 1960s were all disbanded and broken up. The last 2 remaining were General Electric and Berkshire Hathaway, and General Electric is kind of a disaster now. They're turning it around. They're working at it. Berkshire Hathaway I see more as a mutual fund, an odd investment portfolio, and obviously a unique company. But when you look at all that, and then I try to think, okay, because, hey, the big headline on all that is the U.S. is no longer the dominant headquarters of big companies around the world, that it's lost a huge amount of market share. And you can also see it domestically, as New York City dominated that list 60 years ago, and now is hardly on it. If you look at the top 50, top 100 companies, there are few companies based in New Jersey and Connecticut, but the movement has been massively to Texas and to other places around the U.S. Dallas has gained huge. ExxonMobil, JCPenney, American Airlines all moved from New York City, their headquarters, to Dallas, Fort Worth. Toyota USA division moved from California to Texas. Oracle is moving. Tesla, we may see soon, so on and on. But if you look at it around the world, Asia is going to continue to gain, and it isn't going to be just state-owned companies, although they have. I went over and toured China a couple of years ago. It's very difficult to get your head around how the Chinese economy and companies work. I was reading, very, very few people in China are members of the Communist Party, which controls everything. It's a very small percentage population. But the entrepreneurs start these high-tech businesses and Alibaba and all these jazz, and they aren't they aren't members of the party. But then to get ahead and to get the contracts and everything, they become members of the party because they just have to pull it off. So it's very hard to kind of sort all that out. But there are going to be more Korean companies. There are going to be more Indian companies. The Tatas, what they bought, I think Land Rover, Jaguar, all these operations, incredible history and family. You can learn a lot from their history. The Southern Hemisphere has been left out of all that, right? All these lists, there's nobody in there from the Southern Hemisphere. Well, now you have the beer industry, while the big guy, Anheuser-Busch InBev, I think that is the full name now, it's technically headquartered in the Low Countries, Luxembourg or Belgium, but their biggest market is the United States, and it was a merger of a Brazilian-controlled outfit with a South African-controlled outfit. SAB Miller was South African, the Ambev and Anheuser-Busch and all that was Brazilian. And the Brazilian guys, called the 3G Capital Group, who also bought Kraft and Heinz and merged them and keep buying stuff, want to buy things for hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe $1 billion. Warren Buffett partners with them sometime, but the 3G group from Brazil is, but interestingly, they have not made an investment in Brazil in like 40 years or something. There are going to be companies rise up from Indonesia, the world's 4th most populous country, one that I love and have visited a few times, and is kind of off the map, for a lot of people, but they've made a huge amount of progress. They really have a stable democracy now after a lot of ups and downs, to put it mildly. Your Asian tiger. I mean, come on, look at Taiwan and its role. I expect Thailand to show up. Colombia may come up with them. Mexico never shows up on any of these lists. But hey, Mrs. Baird's Bread, which used to run all these ads about, hey, we're good old Texas people. It's owned by Grupo Bimbo, the Mexican giant, which is, I'm not sure if they're the biggest bread producer in America, but I think they are. and have bought all these companies. And the glass industry company called Vitro makes the wine bottles and everything. The biggest Coca-Cola franchisee, well, it's neck and neck now with the European guys, but used to be the biggest and still one of the biggest, is a company called FEMSA, out of Mexico, which is just a wonderfully run company. They own a convenience store chain called OXXO, OXXO, and they're opening something like 3 new stores a day all over Latin America. Now they're big in the drugstore and the gas station industry too. I expect to see Mexican names, maybe not in the top 20, but in the top 100 and so on. At the same time, there are some industries which I find fascinating, which every part of the world has its player. So in other words, if you look at the tire industry, there's 3 giants. There's Goodyear, which is a US company. There's Bridgestone, which owns Firestone, which is a Japanese company. And there's Michelin, which is a French company. So that's kind of a nice balance. And in autos, it's Toyota, Volkswagen, and I'm pretty sure General Motors is still number 3. But Volkswagen has been the biggest the last few years, and Toyota and they are kind of neck and neck last I looked at the figures. So it's just it's a global world. It's a trend that's been going on for like 500 years to become more and more and more global world. But anybody that hates globalization, that train has left the station, and nothing is going to stop it. It may get its knees nicked here or there, you know, some regulation or law slow it down or something, but it's all integrated. And all these great companies, often the best way to invest overseas is to buy some of these US companies. People like Coca-Cola make over half their profits from outside the US. Colgate-Palmolive, founded in 1806. It's one of the best ways to invest in Latin America. It's a wonderful company. So it all gets more blurred. And as Ray and I were talking about, UPS, Asia is their future. The airline industry, China, Asia. And the other thing too is behind that, if you study incomes and the growth of the economies, Africa will come along. It was totally left out of this for so long. South Africa had a small role, but overall, the global economy, Africa was not involved. The disease, the poverty, the corrupt governments, you go on and on about the reasons. But now we're beginning to see change, and most of the people, a friend of mine wrote a book called Fewer, Richer, Greener, which I highly advocate you read. Brilliant, one of the smartest people I've ever met, a guy named Lawrence Siegel. And it was a bestseller on Amazon. It's only been out about a year. But he talks about the future of the world, how there'll be fewer people than a lot of people expect. The population growth rate will slow dramatically. That will, all of us, the whole world will be richer, better off. And the world will be more environmentally safe, and gives lots of data, and as I always love, lots of historical perspective. So yeah, right. there's a long answer to that one.
Well, that's a great and comprehensive answer, and lots to think about. Fewer, richer, greener, huh?
Yeah, oh, it's a wonderful book. It's just every page full of new insights and provoke your thinking. Yeah.
Well, this leads me the idea that businesses changed, what's prominent, what industries are most important, that's evolving. And, you know, right now, given the recent events in the world, we're seeing governments trying to grapple with this, trying to understand what's happening, and also who should have responsibility for what, and how powerful companies should be allowed to be, and how do we prevent things like cybersecurity and so on. So there are a lot of conversations going on in among governments, in pools of national governments, and within national governments as well. So what aspects, sometimes I think governments are very responsive to the current situation. We're always talking about the current situation and jumping on the current situation, dealing with the current situation. But what aspects of business history should governments consider when they are making plans and decisions?
Man, there is so much there to unpack, as the buzzword is these days. You know, let me start out by saying, if you take the long-term view, which I always try to take, the whole issue of geographically, at what level should regulations take place, is a very tricky one. So, for example, in many ways, I'm a believer, well, they used to call it states' rights, but I believe in the states making most of the decisions. And in fact, I mean, you know, there's no federal law against murder or rape. You know, our fundamental legal system is at the state level in the United States. All the really big, important things are state laws. The key, the 10 Commandments or whatever, you know, and so you know, when I was a kid, if you wanted to be a socialist, you could move to Minnesota and have high taxes and lots of welfare and benefits. And if you wanted to be a libertine and do whatever you wanted to, you could move to Las Vegas. You know, the states were incredibly different, and people had the options of moving around. I think you can make a lot of cases, a lot of good cases, a lot of things. Well, and because the states can also learn from each other. It's just like when I was working for a big department store company, we let our operations in Washington, D.C. and St. Louis and Los Angeles each try things. And then they get all the heads of them together and say, okay, what worked and what didn't? No, okay, let's try that. So you get more experimentation. And the whole logic applies all the way down to county and city level. So I'm going to make a good case for that. Then I'm writing a prospectus, raising money for one of my startups. And I write this offering document that's going to go out in several different states, a private placement memorandum. And I call it a prospectus because that's what you're legally required to call it in Texas. I forget the details of which state was which. And then I began to print them up, and I'm about to mail the one to my friend in Colorado. My lawyer, oh, no, don't do that. That's illegal in Colorado. You get thrown in jail in Colorado. You can't call it a prospectus. It's got, and there were things even in the financial statements and the whole presentation. Well, take that paragraph out and put this one in. So at that point, I'm kind of like, oh man, it might be easier if we had federal rules about stock offerings. And a lot of states now have adopted these general codes so that they are the same. But, you know, the whole sales tax thing is a nightmare. You know, should it be charged on the state it's shipped from, where the customer is? You know, I used to collect synthesizers, musical instruments. I still love them and everything, but I sold my collection. But, you know, I'd go to my friends at the big music stores in Austin, and I love shopping at a local store because you're helping them maintain their inventory and pay their employees. But then like on a $2,000 synthesizer, and this is back in the 80s, well, the 8% sales tax that I don't have to pay to these New York mail order guys, this is long before Amazon, you know, that's $160. So I actually came up with a rule where I would pay up to 15% more to buy locally, you know, and I don't know that I held 100% strictly to that, but I had my own kind of personal rule because sales taxes are what pay for our highways and all kinds of stuff, you know. So, but that basic idea, should it be at the bigger level or the smaller level, has always been with us. And now it's not just my county against your county, state against state, it's country against country. And the global world is not prepared for this. The companies have been global a long time. Coca-Cola has been selling their soft drinks outside the U.S. since the 1890s, maybe even the 1880s, and has made over half their profits from overseas. Or I don't know, I would just guess at least 50, 60 years they've been majority overseas, and true of many other U.S. companies. And the global organizations are not really set up for it. And anytime you deal with it, and the same was true of all the state issues and sales tax and all that, but now it's on the global level, is those political entities aren't going to win and yield that power. I mean, there was a big ruckus a few years ago when General Electric tried to buy Honeywell, and the U.S. antitrust people approved it, and the Europeans didn't. And historically, the American companies would have laughed, gone ahead and done it, and say, well, try and stop us, or, well, then we'll sell Europe, not that. Doesn't matter that much, or whatever. It did not make huge headlines, but that deal, it killed the deal. I guess the Honeywell European operations were important enough, whatever, I forget the details. But, you know, you're going to run into more and more of that. And then you have is it EULA and all that jazz, you know, that the websites had to deal with that Europe put in. But then, well, you got to do it global. My dad was a marketing manager for a glassware company, and it was a nightmare for them when Canada required that all labels be in French and English. They added that. And here, my dad's company, whatever, 4% of their sales were in Canada, I would guess, or something. But all of a sudden, but it was big enough you didn't want to lose that. 4% matters, you know. Take a company and have a 4% sales decline this year, you know. So they had to relabel every single thing they made for the whole market because it isn't cost effective to just try to pick out the Canada boxes and all that, you know, and I had to reset them, you know, reprint everything. So all those things I've just said, just say, I don't have an easy answer. It's very complex. But it's going to be with us for a long time. Now, going back to corporate power, it is an oversimplification, but the best way I can phrase it is I don't believe any corporation, unless it has government backing, has power with a capital P. There's no company that can force me to buy anything. There's no company that can force me to go to work for it. There's no company that can force me to go out of business. If I'm a business person, you know, all my business failures were my own fault or other broader dynamics that affected other people too. If the government endorses if the government owns a company, as in China, or in like some countries, the railroads are owned by the government, the post office is owned by the government, like in the United States, but I think the Germans and the Dutch maybe both privatized theirs. The telephone systems are owned by the government in some countries and not in others. The broadcasting, television, government owned in some countries. But in the US, while it wasn't government owned, AT&T was effectively a government supported entity. 85% of all the telephones in America were AT&T and the entire long distance system. They had worked out early in that company's history kind of a truce, a way to work together, and the prices were regulated. Utilities, you know, they used to, in economics, use the term natural monopoly, and that meant, well, you can't have two electric companies because it'd be too expensive to run wires in every house. You can't have two telephone companies. It'd be too expensive to run two wires to every neighborhood, you know, and on and on. You can't have two water companies. Well, over time, well, the telephone thing ended, and now we have lots of phone companies. And then because of the cell phone invention and all that. And then the electricity thing got deregulated and opened up, although, again, that was very complex and still not all solved, as we witnessed here recently in Texas. But there are fewer natural monopolies than there used to be. And then, even in them, they were government controlled in terms of their pricing, their rates, their profit levels. And a friend of mine used to testify on rate cases in front of state commissions. You had, in the United States, the airline industry, the railroad industry, trucking industry, they were all, their pricing and their routing and their most important decisions were government controlled. The Interstate Commerce Commission told all those companies, the Civil Aeronautics Board did the airlines, the ICC did the others, told them how much they could charge, when they could change their rates, where they could go. And the history is littered. I mean, there were airlines, Continental Airlines went to the Civil Aeronautics Board and said, we want to lower our fares. And the CAB said, no, you can't do that. It wouldn't be good for the industry. Those things disappeared under Jimmy Carter in the 1970s. They basically were closed down after, like, well, they were founded in the 1880s, 1890s, the airline thing a little later, 30s, 40s. But after decades, they said they're useless and they're hurting society. And since then, like, airlines have become much cheaper, they've become much safer, much, you know, I think on time is at least as good, probably. Trucking has opened up. Most of the big giant trucking companies from the 60s are no longer with us, or a fraction of their size, and you have a whole new crop of new trucking companies. Airlines, there were no new major airlines created for like 40 years. Because what happens when you set up those government regulatory agencies is what my old professor, George Stigler, he was the University of Chicago economist, won the Nobel Prize for his ideas, what he called the capture theory. And that's it. Okay, the farmers, the shippers, they all hated the railroads. The railroads were the biggest industry in America, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Huge, big, powerful companies. And kind of everybody hated them. Kind of like the way everybody hates cable and all this jazz, but they still do business with them. They'd rather have them than not have them. And then they created the public all went in, newspaper headlines, editorials. Oh, we got to put our clamp on the railroad. So they create the Interstate Commerce Commission. Well, that first meeting of the ICC, all these shippers and all these other people, they all show up and say, oh, yeah, we want this. The second meeting, who shows up? Who has a vested interest, a continuing vested interest? The railroads show up. And over time, these government agencies are captured by the industry. And they become tools for special interests. And you saw this when Southwest Airlines started up. I think they spent, 3 years in court? That's one reason that Herb Kelleher was a lawyer and became the guy that built Southwest Airlines, because he was out there, because Braniff, an American, some are too young to remember Braniff, they just wanted to stomp these guys out. And because of the regulatory agencies, they had the power to do that. And they fought it in courts. When I came to Texas, started Bookstop, I said, okay, I want to be able to ship books to anybody's home in Texas. One of our customers, call in, order a book, right? This is way before Amazon. This is 1982. It was illegal for me to do that in Texas. Why was it? UPS was not allowed to handle intrastate shipments in Texas, from one point to another in Texas. Why was that? And that was true in, I forget, 20 or 30 states. It was because the Texas-based trucking companies, Central Freight Lines, I think was their name, they had the legislature in their pocket. And there were rules, just like the auto dealers have the legislature in their pocket. And that's why they're only open 6 days a week. They don't want to work that hard. Most of them now open Sunday and close Saturday. So, and antitrust, I can start a whole nother conversation about that, because everybody's all riled about Google and all that. But yes, because I can go on and on and on.
And we would love you to, but we are going to run out of time. And I do want to take one.
Okay.
I have another question for you, but just very quickly to wrap up this particular line of thought. So should governments not bother? Is regulation ultimately going to prove harmful? Is it that it's a bad idea? Is it that it's been badly done and could be done better? What is your conclusion from these lessons?
As fast as I can. First thing, I think you have to break regulation into all the different types, because the airlines still have safety regulations, right? They no longer have pricing and route regulations. The trucking still has safety, driver sleep, and all that. So there's safety regulations, there's antitrust, anti-monopoly, there's zoning in cities, there's building codes, there's disclosure. As a business information junkie, I love the fact that the SEC and the New York Stock Exchange and everybody makes companies keep telling us lots of data. As time goes by, they have to report more, and they didn't used to have to even report sales and profits. They didn't have to tell you what their executives made. And over the years, it just gets more. As a user of the data, I love it. And actually, I think even when I work for big companies, the smart business leaders think transparency, to use the buzzword, I call it honesty, openness, is good. So first of all, you have to think about different categories. In general, the antitrust part, which is the one that was my major in college within economics and the part I've studied the most, I haven't seen anything really good come out of it. The government regulators also, beside the capture issue and all that, they're always looking backwards. When I worked for big department store companies in the 1960s, they said, well, like Macy's is buying Foley's and all this. There were different names then, and that's not good. The department stores. Well, they were looking at the past. They were not paying any attention, which those of us in the industry who worked in the industry were paying attention to, that Kmart was cleaning our clocks, right? And that TJ Apparel is where those department stores made most of their money. TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Ross Store, Old Navy, The Limited, The Gap, they took an enormous chunk out of that business. And yet every time the antitrust people looked at it, they just looked at it as Macy's versus Foley's versus Marshall Field's. Are you with me? And now when they were getting on Amazon's case, Bezos was talking to Congress. He said, look, we're half the size of Walmart. Walmart buys a lot more of everything we buy from the suppliers. We're not the only guy in town. And I remember one of the Congress members say, oh, you say that doesn't count. That's the way they always think, They don't understand the big picture. Not that many of them have ever been in business. There's too many of them. They're lawyers, and lawyers get rich off all this, right? The more regulation, even when you have, because antitrust people came after IBM, that never amounted to anything. They came after Eastman Kodak, which was the closest to a monopoly ever achieved by an American company in history, in a big industry where they had 70% of the market. The monopoly is 100%. But they got it without government support. They did it through great products. But the antitrust people came after them, came after General Motors. All those cost hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money in the cases, and all of them, nothing ever happened. Microsoft, they came after Microsoft. They got a few little things, but they basically ended up spending a lot of money. writing thousands of pages of reports. Ultimately, the only thing that's going to pull down these companies is a good competitor, is letting people, and that happens. Ask Sears Roebuck. I can assure you, Sears, which I knew the company intimately, have studied all my life, they thought they owned the world. They thought no retailer on earth could ever touch them. And now it's dust to dust. And hey, and Jeff Bezos, he keeps saying someday Amazon will go bankrupt, and he's just trying to get his people to to stay lean and to stay hungry. The closest, the biggest share now of any of these is Google in search. Email me, my email, just hit the contact button on my website and it comes straight to me, and I'll send you my business plan to take on Google. And you can go out and raise the 5 million or 500 million it would take to do it. I'm getting a little late to do another startup.
Well, that's a fascinating challenge for a team of UT students.
I have shown it to so many tech entrepreneurs, and they're all scared to death of Google. But everybody was scared to death of Sears. Everybody was scared to death of General Motors. All it takes is one Toyota, one Walmart. Sam Walton, country bumpkin from Missouri. I mean, he didn't know anybody. He had no capital. And if you'd invested $10,000 when it first went public, it'd be worth something like $100 million today. Even if you'd waited 10 years till he was $1 billion company, you'd be ahead by about 30 million on your $10,000 investment. So you can bet on the little guys. Don't bet against an Elon Musk. Entrepreneurs can do amazing things, but not that many of them.
Okay, well, that is a super segue. That's a super end comment for my next question, which is, could you make some recommendations of books that business people and students should read and people they should study? Who are some of the important entrepreneurs from the past that people don't know, or the present, that people don't know about but should?
Well, let me start with that one. If you go to AmericanBusinessHistory.org, I've got about 25 biographies on there, something like that. A friend wrote a few of them. I wrote 22 of them or 3 of them or whatever. Those are all very interesting people that are not well known, and every single one of them is full of lessons. If you started with Jim Casey that built UPS, if you're interested in the entertainment and media business, Adolf Zukor, who built Paramount movie theaters and a movie studio, and really was really created the movie industry in so many ways. Because I gave a talk, you'll see in the videos, I have the whole histories of different industries. And I gave my talk on the history of the movie industry over in the UT Film School. And the professors and the class, all of them said, we have never heard any of this. Because in film school, they're focused on the directors. As a business history student, I'm focused on who are the people that came up with the money, that went and raised the money, that risked their lives to do it and hired those directors and picked those directors. They don't get the credit. And Adolf Zukor, Z-U-K-O-R, he was the greatest of them all. Lived to be 100 years old, was a visionary till the day he died, was still checking like weekly box office receipts in his late 90s. They're all, you can learn from all of them. And reading biographies is the best way to understand business, whether it's big business or startups, because you learn how they thought, you learn kind of mistakes they made, you learn they weren't geniuses, they weren't endowed with these really unusual attributes, they weren't all Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. A lot of them were very ordinary people, a lot of them were awful students. Most of them had no degrees, if you go back to the 19th century and early 20th century leaders, high school dropouts and all that. All the mistakes, all the heartaches, all the times they should have given up and most people wouldn't have. So there's no better way to learn. So I would say start there. And then just look through some of those people. Casey's wonderful, but all the ones, Milton Hershey, the chocolate king who left his entire fortune to an orphanage because he was an orphan. We tend to do ones that are a little less famous. People like John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Henry Ford, and Ray Kroc at McDonald's. They're pretty well covered. And so I write about people like that. We do less often, although I did a long biographical piece on Walt Disney, who is my own personal favorite all-time entrepreneur, and you'd have to read the article to see the reasons. As far as books, if you want to understand the history of American business, there is one book that is like the must-read. It's a serious book. I don't know, it must be 500 pages maybe. It's called The Visible Hand by a man named Alfred Chandler, Chandler. It's won all these awards. It's like a 30-year-old book, maybe. It's just wonderful. It's just wonderful. And it really tells you the whole history and evolution of American business. And of course, so it's focused on oil and railroads and all that. But I can tell you, those lessons, the challenge is, how do you adapt those? It's just like, people in the Christian churches say, well, what would Jesus do? Well, what would John Rockefeller do now? I mean, you have to use your brain and think hard and meditate on what you read, adapt it. Same if you read Peter Drucker, who I think is the most important person to read to understand management in general. Read his book, Management, Tasks, Responsibilities, and Priorities, or I forget the full title. Read the original edition, not the 30th anniversary edition where somebody started messing with his ideas, because he understood the whole picture as well as anybody. But The Visible Hand by Alfred Chandler is if you're seriously interested. And a person like me, I find it a page turner. Some people might not find it that way. This next book, I'm going to recommend two more. One is called They Made America by Harold Evans. And he was a British editor. He may have edited Vanity Fair magazine, I forget. Anyway, he was a writer type, not even into business really. And he moved from England to America, and he was amazed at America's energy and the innovation that we came up with, the innovations. And so he studied American business and wrote this wonderful book, They Made America. PBS made a series out of it. The series doesn't compare with the book. And it's just short biographies, stories about all different men and women, people in cosmetics, all sorts of things. And it's just great. And if you get it, don't get the paperback, because the publisher was too cheap to put all the photos and illustrations in that. Get the hardcover. You can even find used copies, because it's a few years old now, because the pictures really mean a lot. And if you read my biographies online, they all have lots of illustrations. And we cover people of all races, and men and women and everything. And then the third one that I'll throw out, so Chandler is for serious. Evans is a little lighter reading. But then if you're really in a hurry, this just came out. There hadn't been a real good survey book about American business history written since about 1990. And just last year, it's called American Business History, A Very Short Introduction. I'm not sure if I'm getting it up there or not. But this is a series, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press, my favorite publisher, wonderful one. I like a lot of them. They have done 600 different topics. And this is called American Business, but it's a little, like 120 page, and it's a small book. There we go. And Walter Friedman wrote it as one of the top business historians at Harvard Business School. And I'm a very tough judge. A lot of business books, I think, aren't worth the paper they're printed on. This one's dynamite. So if you're in a real hurry or just want to get a quick look or a start, American Business History, A Very Short Introduction. All those books I recommend are on Amazon. Bill Gates once said, if you're only going to read one book about business, the most important book to read is My Years with General Motors. And that's the book that tells you how General Motors became great, written by Alfred Sloan, the man who made it great. I read that when it came out. I would have been 12, yeah. I still reread it every few years. So I add that one in, but that's about one company and how you build a great company. But if you do Drucker and Sloan and The Visible Hand, you're going to receive a wonderful business education. In Drucker's case, he wrote tons and tons of books. I think the one, Management, is the best one to start with. But you can also find a Daily Drucker, which is like devotional you read every day. The Essential Drucker, some of his key thoughts. Whatever you read of his is golden. If you're willing to take the time and adapt it from his era, and that takes work, but man, that's work that really pays off.
Super. Well, that's really that's exciting, actually, because it's fascinating to read about people and the time they lived in, and knowing
it's been said that all history is biography.
Yeah,
I'm a believer in that.
And that's a very vibrant way to learn about to learn history and to learn about business too, that we are not often advised to do.
And you often see some of these people are half crazy. And a lot of their personal lifestyle issues, Edison, who didn't sleep, he did like 3-hour naps, and and some of them did some really bad things. Even people whose companies I admire, and in total their life was really admirable. You know, you'll find some drunks in there, you know.
Well, that'll
Certainly,
spice it up.
yeah, certainly in the 1930s was a long way from the Me Too movement. That shows up in some of their lives, but in others not. Old Zukor was, you know, loyal and to his wife, and you know, every day of his life till the day he died, kind of thing. So they're human. They're human. None of them are perfect, and they're fascinating to study.
Well, thank you for that. And then I really would like to take one of the questions from our attendees here
Great.
tonight. And I'm picking one sort of at random, but this is so topical right now. So, given the historical perspective that you bring to current events, um, what do you think of the direction that big businesses are taking into sustainability and I guess ESG companies and priorities and so on? Um, what is your
Yeah.
perspective on that?
Yep. Yep. And actually, I made this picture behind me is of Hong Kong. I shot that on my way to give a talk in Singapore to their big state sovereign fund, you know, billions or trillions of investment. And I spoke to like their 800 top managers. And it was a conference on sustainability. And so I got up there and gave a talk and showed the decline of Sears and the rise of Walmart, the decline of GM, the rise of Toyota, and several cases from several, the fall of RCA, which was the big consumer electronics company, and the rise of Sony. And I said, look, because they were investors looking at how do we make sure we have sustainable investments? I said, they have sustainable investments by investing in companies that are obsessed with their customers and make their products better every day and keep their eye on the ball and don't get distracted. So in case that isn't clear, I essentially was, what was I saying? The devil's advocate, or, you know, kind of putting a thorn in their side. The thing is, overall, and hey, how do I say it nice? I believe in do-goodism. Before I lost all my money, I gave my college a dormitory. You know, they got millions more than I ended up with. I live on Social Security now. You know, I've been really active in a lot of nonprofits. Book Stop, we gave, before we were profitable, we gave money to libraries and literacy causes we believed in. So I don't want to knock any of that, you know. At the same time, I can't tell you how many, let's take small business, mom and pop retailers. I love retailers. I love a good retailer. Somebody like Precision Camera, independent store there in Austin, wonderful world-class retailer. If he had decided to become a big chain, he and his wife could have done it. Friends of mine. Bicycle stores in Austin that are wonderful, world-class. But a lot of the mom and pops that I've dealt with and competed with, the bookstore business and everything else, they're spending all their time on the Chamber of Commerce or at the country club or being civically active. And they weren't paying attention to their product, and they weren't paying attention to their services, and they weren't paying attention to their customers. And when they went broke and had to fire every single employee, they blamed everybody but themselves. Focus is so critically important to success. You have to have, I sat in on a strategic planning meeting for one of the major units at the University of Texas at Austin, not McCombs, not the School of Information where I'm very active, but another unit the dean asked me to sit in. And I just sat and listened for the first 2 hours of this all-day strategic planning session. And at the end of it, they turned and said, well, what do you think? And I said, you have just said you have 22 goals. You have no goals. You will never achieve any of them. You with me? I mean, it's just, and that's a major challenge for presidents and leaders of universities, whether they're private or public. You have so many forces, so many special interest groups, genders and races and industries and labor and managers and deans and staff and adjunct. There's been books written about how a major state university is almost impossible to manage. Corporations actually have a little fewer, but not many. And when you get to Walmart size, you know, these places pass laws. Well, we don't want to store bigger than 100,000 square feet. Well, Walmart builds 99,000 square feet. But what a pain in the butt, right? You know, and But if you look at a Walmart, because people don't pass laws to stop Target, you with me? And which Target, I can sure you throw some parties because of that, Good. We hate Walmart too. The thing is, if you're the head of Walmart, you have all these issues. You have to make statements about BLM and about Confederate statues. You got a lot of stores in the South. You've got labor, you've got management, you've got investors, you got Wall Street. You got some of Wall Street that loves you. Some thinks you should grow faster. Some think you should sell this division. And then you basically got business. You have to be in stock on 120,000 items in 3,000 locations. I mean, I actually came to the conclusion most corporate chiefs deserve every penny they're paid. When I see the head of Walmart, or the woman from India that ran PepsiCo was making like 13 million. She came and spoke at McCombs. Wonderful. Indra Nooyi ran it for several years, retired a year or two ago. I think she earned every penny. Now there's some that don't, that rip off the shareholders and all that. But so that's a very long way around, is people need to be very careful. They really need to understand what's important. What leads to the best gain for society. I can make the case that the best thing Walmart can do for society is to be in stock and to have low prices and to increase the wages of its employees and to treat its suppliers well. Now, they may or may not be doing all those things. We could have another 2-hour discussion on that. I can make a case the most important thing for Apple to do is to make good smartphones. I wish they would lower the prices. I wish they paid a bigger share of their shareholders get something like 5 times as much of the profit as their employees do. Walmart's the opposite. The employees get like 5 times more than the shareholders do. I did a tabulation of something. UPS is like 80% of the money you pay them goes to their employees. The shareholders are further back. And when companies lose sight of that, it's over with. It's not going to happen overnight. So I think, to the extent that you're going to be socially, and the other thing is some companies are awful, maybe evil, and then they show up at all the social responsibility things and sit on committees and give big checks and pat themselves on the back. You with me? I mean, just like look at some of these politicians that are just jerks in the office. On TV, they come across, I love everybody, I'm everybody's friend. And they're just assholes. And then it comes out, on both parties. And companies can be like that too. So I would just suggest corporate leaders be very careful. Focus on where you can really make a difference. I was at one conference, retail conference, and I was a Walmart executive, and they said, look, 18-wheelers, of which we have the second or third biggest fleet in America, whatever, 18-wheelers get 10 miles a gallon. We went to all the truck manufacturers and say, we want it to be 5. There is nobody in America who has more to gain by lowering energy consumption than Walmart. There is no single organization on earth, except maybe the US government, that has more to gain by being a conservationist than Walmart. And the truck manufacturers say, well, wait a minute, we can't do 5 miles a gallon. And Walmart says, well, can you meet with our people and let's work on 9? And then later was a business plan competition, maybe at McCombs, and somebody come up with a way to take your trash and turn it into power. Hey, Walmart was the first one to say, oh, we're going to test that in 20 of our stores. You take the boxes out back, dump them in this thing, it powers the lights the next day. When you can make a difference, book stop, we would give excess books to libraries. We big adult literacy book sale in Austin. We gave them tens of thousands of dollars for the books that were no longer of value in the bookstores. Find where you really can make, because people get so far outside their field of expertise where they can make a difference. So I guess my bottom line is just be very careful, because there is so much talk and it's all so politicized, and a lot of companies are doing a lot of stupid things. And if their leaders take their eye off the ball, it's not good for anybody. Jobs are lost, investments are lost, towns closed down. General Motors treated its employees great, but it made a lot of mistakes. And my hometown with 27,000 employees at General Motors now has 0. At one point had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation. So focus, make great products, make them better every day, love your customers, talk to your customers, treat your people right, basics, they're all, go back and study the greats 100 years ago. Study Jim Casey, the UPS guy, his whole life. You know, they have 200,000 drivers making 100 grand plus a year each. I'm pretty sure their average is up above that. They get overtime on the holidays. And I talked to one driver, had 13 kids, and all of them have free health care, 100% paid health insurance till they're 26 or whenever, you know, that age change comes. You don't see anybody leave UPS, none of the drivers anyway. And they're Teamsters, they're unionized. Yeah, the world is more complex. There are more subtleties out there than people realize.
Well, that is a wonderful end note for this fascinating set of insights. I'm going to watch this again. Actually.
Oh, great. Oh, and before I forget, my email address, my personal email address is Gary Hoover. So my name without the ER, GaryHoov at msn.com. I've been online so long, I have an old Microsoft network, MSN. And I read all my own emails. I get 1,000 a day. I answer all of them. Well, a lot of the 1,000 are spam, but a lot aren't. And I get to it as soon as I can. So any further questions you have, any thoughts, you want to argue with me about all these ideas, my best friends are ones who argue with me. I think one of the most dangerous things you can do is only hang out with people who agree with you. I think that's a dead end. I have friends I agree with too. But yeah, email me any way I can help. You know, any way I can help you achieve your goals, achieve better understanding of business. That's what makes my life worth keeping going.
Well, it's easy to see why you were our first entrepreneur in residence, pioneering that concept at McCombs. And, you know, I'm so grateful. We really appreciate your coming back for this conversation. And I hope that the American Business History organization will have.
And before I forget, all you folks have got younger siblings, is tomorrow, actually, we will launch a high school essay contest. $3,000 first prize, I think $1,000 second prize, 18 prizes, right? 1,000 to 1,500 word history of a local business. Now it could be a giant. You could go to Dell, you know, or you could go to Oracle here pretty soon in Austin. But it could also be a restaurant or a local. I think we said business has to be at least 10 years old and have 10 employees. But and you got to be 18 or under. But if you've got friends, relatives, and that'll all be posted on the AmericanBusinessHistory.org website, certainly by the end of this week, with all the details on how to submit. And then it runs through July 9th is the deadline, so people can do it, you know, when summer starts. But we're trying to get more and more people to study business history. The drama of it. You know, all these stories I write should be made into movies, because it's a human drama. It's so much more important than sports. It affects more people's lives, and yet we don't engage with it that way. And the battle between Volkswagen and Toyota and General Motors and Hyundai and Kia, there's no sports competition that's as exciting to me, you know, or Coke and Pepsi or UPS and FedEx. So, but yeah, email me with questions and tell your friends about the essay contest once we sign up for our newsletter. That's easy. It's free. Comes out every week.
Super. Well, that's just a huge number of resources that we all have received. So thank you so very much. In my last conversation with you, you recommended books. The one of mine just arrived today. I'm going to get started on that one. And I've read some of your articles since. And so you have a new fan in me. And
great. And I will add, we hadn't mentioned, I live in a library with 57,000 books. The place is such a mess. That's why I have to use Hong Kong as a background. And so I get 3 or 4 more a day. So I wrote another book on Amazon called A Lifetime Learner's Guide to Reading and Learning. And that's more of a liberal arts thing. It includes stuff about how to think, how to come up with new ideas. But it lists my 160 favorite books. And most of them are not about business. It covers history, geography, science, tech, all sorts of things. And I also have a website that I don't publish very often on called Hoover's World. You can subscribe to the newsletter there. And when I do write about entrepreneurship, how to run companies, that kind of stuff, that'll show up over on Hoover's World. Comments about retailing, always talking about, the future of retailing, the future of the shopping center, future of bricks and mortar, all that jazz. But the future looking stuff would be on Hoover's World occasionally. The history is on every week on AmericanBusinessHistory.org.
Okay, well, we have our work cut out for us exploring all of that. Thank you very, very much. Everyone knows how to get in touch with Gary. And you have our sincere appreciation for a fascinating discussion and tremendous insights.